Hello, I am Ricky's teaching partner. My name is Suzuki. I will be explaining the content of this video to you. This video covers business and company law. I will share information on this topic using an example from a previous exam question that is part of the HKICPA QP Module 10, Business and Company Law. Let's begin discussing the topic now. Topic content relates to law of tort and negligence. Question. Roy runs a small transportation business as a sole proprietor. While Roy was driving his cargo van to deliver goods to a client a few months ago, he received a call from his daughter, who told him she had received an offer from a university in Hong Kong. As Roy was overjoyed, he kept talking to his daughter and did not notice that the traffic light had turned red. Roy ran a red light and knocked down an elderly pedestrian, Mrs. Young, who was crossing the road. Required. Analyse the essential elements of negligence and analyse whether Mrs. Young can bring a claim against Roy on the grounds of negligence. The question requires students to analyse the case relating to negligence. This means breaking down the case into the four components of negligence to demonstrate their understanding of its structure and meaning, as well as uncovering hidden or less obvious aspects. More importantly, the content of the answers must relate directly to the case. We begin by examining the question for an initial analysis. The case involves two individuals, Roy, the defendant, and Mrs. Young, the claimant. Roy ran a red light while talking on the phone and failed to notice the traffic signal. As a result, Mrs. Young was knocked down and injured. This is likely a civil case involving negligence. After identifying and analysing the question and its requirements, we can now begin answering the question. Answer. The question required the candidates to discuss the four essential elements of the tort of negligence. Liability for negligence is imposed on a person for her careless acts, which result in personal injury and damage to or loss of property. It is a civil wrong and not a crime, and the wrongdoer is known as tortfeasor. In order to prove the liability for negligence, the plaintiff, Mrs. Young, must establish the following four elements. 1. The defendant owed a duty of care the plaintiff. This duty varies depending on the relationship between the parties and the situation. For example, doctors have a duty to provide competent medical care to their patients. 2. The defendant breached the duty of care. This means the defendant's behaviour did not meet the standard of what a reasonably prudent person would have done under similar circumstances. 3. The plaintiff's injury or loss or damage is directly caused by the defendant. This includes both actual causation, where the harm would not have occurred but for the defendant's actions, and legal causation, where the harm was a foreseeable result of the defendant's actions. 4. The injury or damage must be reasonably foreseeable. This includes physical harm, economic loss, or other kinds of detriment. When answering this question, the relevant law case is referenced. In the famous case of Donahue v. Stevenson, 1932, AC 562, the Judge Lord Atkin created the Neyer principle to establish the duty of care. Everyone must take reasonable care to avoid acts or omissions which you can reasonably foresee would be likely to injure your neighbour. Your neighbour is anyone closely and directly affected by my act, that I ought to have them in my contemplation as being so affected when I am directing my mind to the acts or omissions which are called in question. In this case, as a driver, Roy definitely owes a duty of care to other road users, including pedestrians like Mrs. Young. This means that Roy had a legal obligation to act in a way that would prevent harm to Mrs. Young. Roy owed a duty of care to Mrs. Young, especially if they were in a situation where Roy's actions could foreseeably cause harm to her. By talking to his daughter and running a red light, Roy was very probably in breach of his duty of care. A breach occurs when Roy's actions fall below the standard of care expected in the given situation. If Roy's actions, such as negligence or failure to act responsibly, fell below the expected standard of care, this would constitute a breach. Mrs. Young's injury was directly caused by Roy's careless act of running a red light. This means showing a direct link between Roy's actions and the injury or damage suffered by Mrs. Young. If Mrs. Young was injured in the accident caused by Roy's talking to his daughter and running a red light, this element would be satisfied. It is reasonably foreseeable that a road user like Mrs. Young will sustain injury or harm as a result of Roy's careless act of driving. The final element is demonstrating that Mrs. Young suffered actual damages as a result of Roy's breach. Damages can include physical injuries, emotional distress, or financial losses. Mrs. Young would need to provide evidence of her injuries and any associated costs. Lastly, Mrs. Young is entitled to bring a claim against Roy for damages. Based on this analysis, if Mrs. Young can establish all 4 elements, she may have a valid claim against Roy on the grounds of negligence. In summary, addressing this question requires adhering to the specified requirements to achieve the 4 main elements. It is crucial that the content of the answer is directly connected to the question to avoid losing significant marks. Finally, include a simple conclusion to wrap up the response. The video discusses this point. Thank you all for watching. Goodbye.